Seer here. Welcome to Psych Emblem, a series of videos posted without any particular periodicity in which I talk about psychological aspects and interpretations of the Fire Emblem games. And this is actually the second part of a video about the effects of trauma in characters from the first generation of Fire Emblem Awakening. If you're new around these parts, I do recommend you check out part 1 before going into part 2. Aside from talking briefly about the game, that's also where I provide an introduction on the subject of trauma and trauma-related disorders. You know, just so we start off on the same page. Regardless, let's start by rewinding things a bit. In part 1, we talked about characters who deal with traumatic events without necessarily developing a disorder, such as Lissa, Riken, and Cordelia. While the events left their marks on these characters, the coping mechanisms they developed were healthy enough for them to live their lives without being heavily impacted by them. This time, we're going to talk about some other characters in Gen 1 who are possibly plagued by a trauma-related disorder, and how the game handles that. We'll be talking about lon'qu, Pan, Libra, and Henry. While these characters all have their own distinct personalities, their character arcs all revolve around traits derived from terrible past experiences. lon'qu, for instance, tends to be defined as that one swordsman who is oddly skittish around women. His solo ending in Awakening dubs him the gynophobe, and overall, no matter what piece of media he's featured in, his fear of women is displayed almost like a brand. Naturally, most of his support conversations, and certainly all supports with women, tackle the topic to some degree. Through most of these supports, we verify the symptoms of lon'qu's fear of women, many of which are classic symptoms of PTSD. In his supports with Pan, we learn that his aversion is strong enough to affect non-human women alike, and in their B support, he talks about being haunted by nightmares of his past. In plenty of his supports, he displays an adverse physical reaction to touching women, and in others, he explicitly says he doesn't wish to talk about the source of his fear. So we have constant avoidance, intrusive thoughts and memories, physiological reactions, and a full-blown phobia. All of which remount to one traumatic event in his childhood, the death of his friend Carrie, which he only openly talks about in his supports with Tharja and Shershi. His B support with Tharja kicks off with her offering to cook up a spell to dispel what she believes to be a curse that caused his phobia. But, in order to do so, she needs to know everything about what happened. lon'qu then tells her a story about a girl he used to be friends with, who met up with him and even stole from her parents to see him, even though he was just a poor boy from the slums. One day, they were attacked by a group of bandits, and lon'qu failed to protect his friend, which then left him traumatized for life. As Tharja points out, lon'qu's memory of the event is the curse. However, as lon'qu tells Tharja more about his story in order to give her the materials she needs to prepare a spell, he acknowledges how important his memories are in making him who he is today, not only when it comes to his fear, but to many other sides of him as well. The moment he embraces what happened in his past as an important chapter in his story, rather than something to run away from, lon'qu sets out on the path to recovery. In his supports with Shershi, he is directly and unexpectedly confronted with his past when she brings up a meeting she had with Carrie's parents. While this causes him to put up some strong resistance to talking about the events at first, Shershi chases him down to ensure he will be able to hear the full story. Although lon'qu blamed himself for what happened to his friend, yet another symptom of PTSD, and assumed her parents hated him for it, thanks to Shershi, he learns that the opposite is actually true. Upon finding out about how their daughter felt towards him, Carrie's parents no longer resented lon'qu and were thankful for what he did for their daughter. This is when lon'qu gets closure. And yet, he says, "It is good to be forgiven, and yet I doubt this wound can ever truly heal. Now that he can see his past in a new light, he can embrace it. However, acceptance doesn't make the pain magically go away." One more evidence of this, have his S support with Sully. "My aversion isn't cured, but you've proved that it can be quelled. You have made me stronger. I had accepted my weakness, but you carved it for me by force." And this is the reason why lon'qu, in so many of his supports, is a fantastic representation of mental illness. He is an undeniably strong man who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, and whose strength is not used in a stereotypical "I shall trample over my fears and overcome them" sort of way. While he is able to overcome many of the symptoms, either by force with Sully, by desensitization with Maribel, by revisiting his past and embracing it with Tharja, or by getting closure with Shershi, he is aware that he will not change overnight, and that what happened will probably still accompany him for years to come. And that is fine. The important message given out by lon'qu's character isn't that you should erase your past or that it should become meaningless, but that despite it all, you can feel prepared to deal with it if it ever comes back to bite you, and that even under its weight, you can grow strong and hopeful. The man himself said it best in his ace support with Shershi. "My nightmares will never fade completely, nor will my fear of friendship and love. But for the first time, I can imagine a future that might be different." In a bit of a similar vein to lon'qu, we have Pan, who lost not only her friends, but her family and anyone she could share a sense of community with based on her race. As the last surviving Toggle, Pan carries her legacy with pride, and that is reflected in the way she is depicted in and out of Awakening. Throughout the story, she is depicted as being cold and distant from humans, showing little to no interest in their personal affairs and pushing them away when they try to approach her. Whenever she is thanked for doing anything for the sake of a human, no matter if it is something as small as giving harsh feedback on Stahl's cooking, or something as meaningful as assisting lon'qu with his nightmares, she quickly deflects any signs of gratitude by saying she has done nothing, that she didn't have the human's best interests at heart, or that she doesn't deserve any thanks. Her sharpness doesn't keep her from caring about humans and helping them out of her own accord, though, and this is what makes her so conflicted. On one hand, she had always been told by her mother not to hate humans. On the other, she was the only one who witnessed the massacre led by them and lived to tell the tale, to the point it haunts her in her sleep. Part of her feels anger and pain and burns for revenge. And another part is filled with empathy to the point of feeling touched when she sees a human cry for her kin and teaching common morals to someone who would be willing to go on a killing spree if it made her happy. She can't deal with all of the complex feelings that come with opening her heart to humans, or at least not until they somehow reassure her that they respect her and won't hurt or deny her heritage. It may not be a stretch to say that aside from being afraid of getting hurt by growing close to humans, Pan may also feel guilt for being kind towards the people who hurt her. This confusion can be easily seen when we compare her supports. In her ace support with Libra, she says she never hated humans. In her ace support with Henry, she tries to push him away by saying she has always hated humans. Likewise, while there are supports in which she says whoever she's talking to holds no blame for what a select group of humans did to her village, there are also those in which she does the opposite, albeit about Emmeren's death and not what happened to her kin. Granted, Awakening does have some writing issues and overall inconsistencies, and Pan's supports are an example of this if you compare them. Her backstory, for one, is muddled. She seems to remember Toggle's society enough to replicate potions, healing salves, and talk about some customs of theirs. She also remembers the story about the first Exalt and her mother telling her not to hate humans. However, in her C support with Yarn, she says she doesn't remember much about Toggle families because she was merely an infant when her village was ravaged. If we wanted to give the writers the benefit of the doubt, we could pin these inconsistencies on Pan's trauma. Trauma-related disorders are known to mess with your memories, and not only by bringing them back from time to time. You may also forget entire periods of your life that are somehow related to the traumatic event, and fabricate false memories as a defense mechanism. Considering the impact the event had on her, it could very well be possible for Pan to have forgotten about Toggle families because remembering her family would be too painful, or that she holds false memories of Toggle society as a byproduct of how dearly she clings to her pride. That is not even taken into consideration the fact that she may have made some of this information up on the fly to leave an impression on her partner. But precisely due to how vague all of this is, when you think about the level of some other supports in this game, I find it unlikely for the writers to have put so much thought into it. Regardless, Pan, much like lon'qu, is a character whose severe trauma serves as a defining character trait, but doesn't stop her from being strong and showing other sides to her personality. While both deal with avoidance, guilt, projecting their feelings onto their actions, and having nightmares and intrusive memories, there are also details that differ their stories, making them unique. Up next in Guilt Alley, we have Libra, our beautiful Claude face. No, not that Claude. You know, the other Claude, the priest Claude from Fire Emblem 4. Others in the line of Claude faces, except for you, Raisin, but we'll talk about you some other day. Libra is a calm, gentle priest who wishes to devote himself to the greater good. His selflessness is rooted in You guessed it, traumatic events in his childhood. However, since Libra is defined mostly by his work as a priest and feminine looks, and not by his trauma like lon'qu and Pan, we actually know very little about what happened to him. The only times he talks directly about what happened are in his supports with Virion, Noe, and Tharja. From these conversations, we can gather that Libra was born to a poor family that neglected him and abused him. Their ill treatment of him got to a point in which he was abandoned by his family, resulting in an altercation that left a scar in the back of his neck. When touched, this scar still stirs up painful memories of the life he led with his family, which made him avoid getting personally close to others since he could not trust them and was afraid he would get hurt. In his supports with Tharja, we see the reason why his family treated him poorly was because they believed he was possessed by demons. After he was abandoned, he continued to live in pain until he became a priest. And even then, memories of his past still live on as a terrible darkness inside him. Libra's case seems to be more founded on a series of traumatic events rather than one single event. Sure, being abandoned by his family may have been a landmark in his personal history, but it was mostly an inevitable consequence of the constant mistreatment he suffered up until that point. Although he grew to understand that his family did not have the right to treat him that way, and that he would rather have grown in a loving environment, Libra is still constantly seeking redemption. Something that is clearly seen in his support with Maribel, when he finds such redemption in her view about the law. Of course, there is also the fact that a man who grew up seen as a demon by his parents turned out to be a priest of all things. Through his service to the gods and the community, he can attempt to atone.
Atone for what if he didn't do anything and was actually the victim?
You may ask. Honestly, we don't know the details of Libra's early life, but chances are he really has nothing palpable to atone for. Even if he ever did anything as a child, nothing would justify being abused by his parents. However, we shouldn't forget that one of the main traits of PTSD is an extreme feeling of guilt. This guilt may draw up on anything in the person's experience to justify itself. In Libra's case, he was mistreated by the people who should protect and love him, who were supposed to set the example on how he should act, the highest form of authority in his life. I don't need to use fancy psychology terms or cite people who studied parent-child relationships in depth to point out that our very first relationship, the one we have with our parent figures, shapes a large part of who we are. This means that when the people who are supposed to set the basis of your personality treat you as if you were a demon, the idea that you are a demon is likely to become part of that basis. So instead of a stable basis, you have this massive, bumpy cobblestone that disrupts the entire foundation of your being instead of helping it stabilize. And no matter where you turn to, you will end up tripping over it or stepping on the cracks it creates. Libra is able to look up and understand all of this at a conscious level. He knows why the cobblestone is there and what it causes. However, he is unable to remove it, hence why it still affects his actions and emotions so deeply. He is also likely to harbor negative feelings for his parents but blame himself for it, for the same reason stated before. As much as you realize your negative feelings for your abusers are justified, your inner child may still cling to the notion that they are your parents, and the things they do, and the things they were supposed to do. And chances are this amalgam of feelings such as guilt, loneliness, resentment, and pain is the darkness lurking in his heart. And much like the other two characters mentioned here, this darkness will probably be there for life, although he may be able to shine a light on it and face it a little more easily. And finally, the last and probably least typical character we are addressing here when it comes to trauma.
Here, have some death!
Yep, Henry, the dark mage who is usually brushed off as a one-dimensional stereotypical character due to his flair for death and gore and terrible jokes, placing him in the opposite end of the dark mage stereotype spectrum from Tharja's cranky, inquiring self. To be fair, I wouldn't blame anyone for seeing him this way, especially when it comes to his representation in other media and in a fair share of his supports. But once you read more into him and give him some thought, you can see that Henry's carefree yet edgy personality actually makes sense given his backstory. While we don't have information on whether Henry suffers from some classic PTSD symptoms, it is clear that events from his past left a deep scar that helped shape the Henry we know. We learn more about this in his supports with Pan and Shershi, although there are also brief mentions to it in his conversations with Noe, Olivia, and Muriel. Much like Libra, Henry was brought up in an unloving home with parents who would send him away to a magic academy just to get rid of him. Throughout his life, due to the neglect he suffered, Henry grew farther apart from humans and closer to animals, especially a wolf, who was at a certain point his best friend. One day, when she intended to visit him at his village, she was shot down by hunters, marking Henry's, presumably, first experience with violent death. This experience stirred such strong emotions in him that he implies to have taken revenge on the village hunters by cursing, killing them, or both. Sometime later, he was abandoned by his parents and spent some time living in a forest, where he continued to bond with animals and to see them all die. We can already see how recurrent the themes of loss and mistreatment are in Henry's early life, and how they manifest through two main traumatic events: the wolf's death and being abandoned by his parents. Similarly to Libra, again, Henry's view of himself started being shaped at an early age due to his upbringing. Having been neglected, Henry displays very little concern for his own well-being, and many times for others as well. We see this particularly when he talks about his reckless actions at mage school, and when he impersonally tells Rickon about his former comrades-in-arms. When Henry befriended the wolf, he found more acceptance and care than ever, possibly even establishing her as a mother figure for him. Not only because of their companionship, but also due to how she indirectly affected his emotional development, helping him discover feelings he could not develop with his human parents. I would argue that this is what Tharja refers to in their B support, when she says, "I find your heart difficult to read. It seems devoid of human emotion." As edgy as that sounds, it may be that he is devoid of human emotion because most of his emotional development happened with animals, not with humans. But the psychological development of humans who grow up among animals is a can of worms for another day. Back to topic. Before Henry's emotions could become more stable, the wolf was taken from him. Aside from shaking the still fragile emotional basis he had been building, this event further cemented the belief that he is not worthy of care, and distanced him from humans even more. Lastly, the cherry on the cake, being abandoned by his parents, who seldom acted like true parent figures at that point, and being constantly exposed to the death of his animal friends. Although not all deaths he witnessed must have been violent, despite threats encountered in the wild, such as hunters and predators, having to put up with so much loss fortified a coping mechanism that Henry had likely been developing for a while: death obsession. Despite not being listed in many diagnostic manuals, studies show that death obsession is present in trauma survivors as a symptom of PTSD. This phenomenon was studied in particular depth by a professor from the University of Kuwait, who also created the death obsession scale to organize and measure the concept. Death obsession can be characterized by constant, repetitive, dominant thoughts about death, whether your own or your loved ones. This is one of Henry's signature traits. I mean,
I'll love you with every ounce of my blood until I die. Ooh, when do you think that'll be? I wonder if it'll hurt when I die. Dying is just a costume change, and I can't wait to be a ghost!
After experiencing so much death, Henry's obsession helps him cope, since he can now focus on the fact that life is meaningless anyway, and that, at the end of it all, we will be reunited again on the other side. While the other three characters mentioned here find some sort of healthy way to cope in at least a few supports, Henry's case is a little more indirect. I would argue that the best resolution for him occurs through his supports with Shershi and Pan, in which they encourage him to connect with other people and develop his empathy for humans, which he seems to have lost long ago. These are also the two people he opens up with about his trauma, telling Shershi his story in detail and showing Pan he is afraid of being alone. It is also with them that he shows best his desire to have a family. Although the topic of children is also brought up with Muriel and Noe, Shershi and Pan are the ones who give him not only the opportunity to fight his loneliness and longing for the familial comfort he lost long ago, but also who understand his past and encourage him to become a better person in general. These characters cover a range of sources and coping mechanisms with PTSD, from textbook examples like lon'qu to less typical examples such as Henry. We get to see not only the diverse ways in which mental illness can manifest, but also various ways to heal, all of which involve being open and compassionate with yourself. Not so you can ignore your scars, but so you can look at them with acceptance as you keep moving forward. While the subject of trauma in Awakening hasn't been fully broached yet, we haven't even looked at the kids who lost their families in an apocalyptic world, I will be giving it a break before delving into Gen 2. Fire Emblem has way too much material for analysis spread across its 16 titles, so we'll be taking a look at different aspects from a different title next time, as well as a different theoretical framework in psychology. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you keep supporting Psych Emblem. See yas!